Welcome. What I'd like to do is a kind of short explanation of some of the themes and controversies that are the focus, or that have been the focus of issues in child development. The lecture could be called Themes and Controversies. I may modify that a bit. So when you think about the child, what are those forces? Well, historically, there's been a little bit of a division between the notion of nature, one's inner nature, or the biological inheritance. In fact, many of you may use the term maturation very differently than a developmental psychologist, because maturation doesn't mean getting older and wiser. Maturation is, when we speak of maturation, we speak of a biological unfolding of a genetic potential. For example, just briefly, and perhaps we'll talk about it another time, a child learns to walk as various parts of the nervous system and motor systems mature and develop. They have to be developmentally ready. Of course, they have to have practice, but experience is not the primary factor. You could take a 2-month-old and over again try to teach them to walk, and it would not happen because their central nervous system, their motoric skills, and so on have not adequately developed or matured. That issue of maturation is sometimes considered a conflict or conflicting way to look at a force of development compared to nurture or experience. So examples of nature, you can look at these here, and think about which of these might be biological factors that influence development. Now, nurture, as we pointed out, is really more environmental factors, and environment is such a big range of issues. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but this has to do with experience, ranging from historical conditions you've lived under, to the ways your parents raised you, to the type of school setting, to social policy issues. We'll talk about some of these. What I'd like to say here is most undergraduate textbooks talk about nature versus nurture. But I think at this point we've come to realize that you cannot separate the two, that they're inextricably entwined. And here again, you have some possible factors that you could think of as relating to nurture, or the experiences that contribute to your development. So take a look, take a guess, and some questions asked. Some of the other controversies or differences that you'll see as we talk about theorists are whether or not development is more continuous, more almost like a straight line, we just gradually go up, or whether there's discontinuity in development. And as we talk about the theorists in one of our first major units, you'll see someone like Skinner doesn't take a stage approach. Children learn based on the experiences they have and the reinforcers they have. Whereas someone like a Piaget believes that there are qualitative changes. The children go through stages and they see the world very differently. Again, more modern developmental theorists have found a way to say that it depends on how you look at development, that these are not so much continuity versus discontinuity, but what can best explain the changes we see. There's a similar controversy about stability versus change. You could think about it in terms of yourself. Do you simply become an older version of who you were as a young child? Or do you think who you are today is, significantly different from who you were at an earlier point. And another factor here is whether or not early experiences are really the most crucial and important determinants, factors that influence our development. So there are many other controversies and issues that we're going to talk about here. Very briefly, it's important you read the chapter in the book that covers most of these concepts, or that you ask questions. So we talked about nature nurture. We talked about maturation versus learning, and continuity versus discontinuity, and stability versus change. Another difference between some of the big theorists that we're going to talk about, Skinner, Erikson, Freud, Piaget, Bandura, is whether the child takes an active role in their development, or whether the child is more a passive recipient. And while Skinner didn't really see children as passive to some extent, they are viewed this way because depending on the reinforcers, their experiences, depending on the reinforcers they have, this will strongly influence the child they grow up to be. Okay. In the short reading that you're assigned for the discussion board, you were asked to read a little bit about Alice Walker, the famous author. And I guess the question here is to get you to think about the fact that she was accidentally shot in the eye and blinded. Which kind of factor does that emphasize or illustrate? And probably could argue for at least more than one of these, but think about why you would select your response. Whether it would illustrate how important perhaps her inner nature was over these experiences, or was it experience over her inner nature? Does maturation play a role? How important is early development? Or what was the role of context of development? And we have not yet talked about context of development. Now, context is one of these code words, buzzwords that are very popular now, but what it simply means is a broader definition of your environmental experiences. So we can talk about the homes you live in, the schools you attend, who were your peers, how much did that influence you? Whether or not you had some sort of religious belief and attended some sort of religious institution. What kind of city did you live in, or did you live in a rural area? What was your neighborhood like? What were the playgrounds like? Was it safe? Was it not safe? Was it nurturing? Was it not nurturing? What kinds of settings in terms of universities and colleges were there? Different countries have different cultural beliefs and ways of raising children. So all of these factors involve the context of development. Regardless of all of this, most developmental psychologists agree that development doesn't change, as Freud sort of argued. It's not set in stone at the age of 5 over the Oedipal period. It's lifelong. And we have many different aspects of development, our cognitive development, our social development, and many other factors we will look at. Development being plastic is something I want you to understand, that something difficult could happen to you, yet you may be able to rise to the occasion. If you think about it in terms of someone who has perhaps lost their sight, they may have finely honed sense of hearing that they use and touch to compensate for the the fact that they've lost their sight, so that we have the capacity to change and develop despite obstacles up to a point. It's based on those contexts we talked about. And while we're going to focus primarily on psychology, the paths of development are studied by some related disciplines that we won't focus on. Okay. That seems to be straightforward. And again, simply, we're going to be looking both at biological, cognitive, social, emotional dimensions of development and others, you'll see. What happens in our cognitive development, for example, may affect our social and emotional development. Here's another example of development being plastic. And perhaps this is a simpler definition than my example, but again, you can slow this down and look at it. Some other influences on development and they vary from society to society, are what we sometimes call normative age-graded influences. So in the United States, or let's just take New York, because it may not be true in everywhere within the United States, pretty much all children are expected to enter kindergarten at age 5. At age 18, I think males still have to register for selective service. I do not know yet if females have to. The age graded difference about when you can learn to drive or when you can drink, these vary. And in other cultures, there may be certain ages where certain experiences happen normatively to most children. And some experiences that influence your development have to do with history-graded experiences. For example, people who grew up during the Great Depression in the United States had certain characteristics. For me and for people perhaps younger than me, the internet and using computers and email is just a part of my life. But for people who are older than I am, this can be very confusing and something that they can't master at all. And then, of course, some of us, probably most of us, had some non-normative life events we experienced. A death in the family, a divorce, living through war, or a terrible catastrophic experience of some sort, this kind of thing. And these factors are important in our development. And we'll talk about them to some extent. And the last thing I'm going to emphasize, there may be a few more slides, but it's getting long, is social policy. So social policy has to do with our societies, or in our case, the national government's policies or courses of action that influence the welfare of the people who live in the society. So, for example, in New York, there is a free universal pre-K, and it has an effect on children's educational experiences, on parents' opportunities for reasonably good childcare. In some cultures, we have unemployment insurance, and at some point it was ended due to political controversy. Long-term unemployment was ended. And you can think of a variety of social policies that have affected your life. We have free public education to some extent in this country, whereas other cultures, they may not. Okay, I'm going to end this here. I hope this quick lecture makes up for the one that was moved by the Queensboro website. Thank you.